Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friends Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Gerben van Heerden. Harry, how are you doing?
Hello, I have no complaints. Seems like autumn is on its way in Cape Town. We had our first good rainy day from morning to night, so yeah.
My house faced an assault by lightning very close by, but luckily nothing seems to have been blown during that. And we're also joined today by Chris Hutton, who shortly before I turned on the show today accused me of sounding like a droning fan. Chris, how are you doing?
You need to sing your praises. Be your own biggest fan. That's what I always say.
Very good. All right. Speaking of very good, let's talk about the opposite, which is not very good. So
yes,
we've got some. Thank you. We've got some interesting little pieces of news on what is the ongoing Eskom crisis. And this one is quite interesting for the optimists amongst us in that I think it will dash their hopes and dreams. So we now do have a new minister in the presidency who's responsible for electricity, who is supposed to, I'm not really sure what, because there's already two ministers who are dealing with the Eskom crisis, that being public enterprises as well as minerals and energy. But anyway, we also have this report now from Eskom about the state of their coal-fired power plants. And the unfortunate news is that Eskom was planning to see if they could boost the output of a couple of their coal-fired power plants. So most of our electricity, of course, comes from coal. And one of the major causes of load shedding is that the coal-fired power plants are constantly breaking down. So Eskom was looking at boosting the output from their plants by the end of March by 1,862 megawatts, which would be basically enough to cover all of the electricity needs of Cape Town in the middle of winter. However, Eskom says that despite efforts to improve maintenance and such, the goal will not be achieved. It said in a response to some questions being asked of it. They've got a bunch of German consultants from a company called VGBE Energy, which is assisting them in trying to get more out of the coal power plants. But I think what's important about this story is that it reveals how hollow some of the things that Gwede Mantashe said quite recently when it comes to the Eskom crisis. So as Andre de Ruyter was moving out and Gwede Mantashe was reconfirmed as essentially in charge of our energy mix as the Minister of Mining and Energy, he said that, we actually have a lot of capacity in our coal power plants. They just break down a lot. So all we need to do is some maintenance and things we'll be able to end load shedding. And that joined comments by Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana that I think they said in 18 months we'll be able to get a handle on load shedding. Well, this is the first hurdle, which is, I guess, to see if you can actually boost the coal-fired power plants capacity, and they haven't met it. And in fact, I'm sure all of our listeners agree that they're unlikely to meet any of the others, which is exactly why one should not believe the happy talk coming out of government when it comes to fixing the Eskom crisis. It is not going to be solved in 18 months. At the same time, the new Minister of Electricity urged the public to be patient, which, never mind whether it's true or not, I don't think it's a reasonable thing to say to the public right now, but it's just not good politics. Chris, what do you make of all this?
I wonder on the minister's comments if there's an element of radical honesty where they're trying to sort of shock by, how bad the situation is, and they're trying now to just, I guess, double down on some of we've got the plans in place, just wait, just believe us. And then in terms of like political election, you have to wonder, where is the polling? What is polling telling them in terms of strategy? How do you really convince them the same sort of stuff over and over, but people don't see the actual delivery or turnaround on the ground in terms of turning things around, like a reliable electricity supply? On the coal plants, you can make the argument that they have this magical sort of, platonic ideal of capacity always hanging there. But in the first place, then you need to do the maintenance for them to make sure that they can realize that capacity. But also, secondly, many, if not most, of the coal-fired plants are reaching the end of their sort of operational life. So even that is disingenuous, I think, a comment to say they've got this capacity, that threshold, that ceiling has steadily declined. Even if you were doing 100% good maintenance day to day, as you should have been doing for the last 15 years, that is not actionable or real, something that you can realize, I think, as such. If you look at Eskom's energy availability factor, about 5 weeks ago, they announced a plan around improving that availability factor, this amount of readily dispatchable electricity that they'll have at any point to go into the grid. They aimed for improving that energy availability factor to between 58 and 70%. At this point in time, it doesn't even look like they're going to achieve 55%. In the fourth week of February, the EAF was 51%, and that's significantly lower than even the 54% that they achieved through mid-February. So if you look at the steady decline of the energy availability factor, despite what is talked about potential, this and that, the trend line is ever downwards, and they just don't have the skills, the equipment, all of that sort of stuff, I think, to account for that. You're not seeing a sort of radical move in terms of ending preferential procurement, making sure that you can get equipment and parts cost effectively, getting in the necessary skills to maybe focus on some of the biggest power stations to just fix those. Because if one of them fails, the sort of knock-on effect is even higher. So I think on the energy availability, but also the minister's comments pointing to maybe not even yet having a handle on how bad things are, because that would be admitting that the plan they followed and the sort of ideology they followed has not actually delivered in terms of good service delivery.
So it's been quite interesting to watch Eskom, because we've really seen the limits of how pragmatic the government can be. But there have, of course, been some positive moves. We've seen some moves now to add private generation to the grid, but a lot of it is still months or years away from being implemented. And it's also, for the most part, as far as I understand, most of the stuff that's already in the works is quite small scale. So ultimately won't fix the problem. It's also likely going to drive up, I suspect, the cost of electricity. Although, considering the way Eskom is going now, this probably won't be much of a difference. Sherry, what's your take on this? You sort of got blue in the face talking about the solutions to this, but do you maybe just want to talk about what it is that government could actually do tomorrow to begin turning around things and actually improving things for the people of the country?
Well, yeah, the government seems to think that Minister of Energy is going to make a huge difference. I think all it's going to do is add 30 million, 40 million rand to the taxpayers' bill every year. It's just another minister furthering bloating our civil service. And there's also not a lot of popular support for the energy minister under the broader public. There was a recent poll that was done that showed that the majority of people think that it's not going to make any sort of difference. And then what can be done? I don't think there is much that can be done. Like Chris said, many of our coal power stations are rapidly aging. It's extremely difficult to expand their lives even further, and this is having a tremendous impact on our economy. We're heading for a recession. We've got big retailers such as Pick n Pay and Shoprite and Woolworths that have spent almost R1 billion in the last few months of 2022 simply to buy diesel for their generators. That is capital that they could have pumped into other investments, creating more job opportunities. There's all talks about, we need to shift to more renewable energy and sustainable energy sources. But the problem with that is it can't replace coal in the short term in South Africa, the energy produced by Eskom's coal power plants, they're responsible for 90% of the country's energy. And so it's going to take a very long time to shift away from that. And also, for example, with the retailers, the big malls, people might ask, okay, but you can put solar panels, huge solar panels on these shopping centers to supply them with energy when there's a cutoff. But the thing is that many of these retailers have communicated that these solar panels that they install onto their rooftops are only able to supply energy for like a minimal amount of time, for a few hours. And we're now in a situation where we're flirting with stage 8 load shedding, and these renewables can't be substitute for such a tremendous cut in power for such a long time. I think what should have been done a long time ago is just to avoid the skills exodus that we've seen from Eskom. And you do that by cutting legislation that has really damaged skills generation and skills retainment at the utility. But we've spoken a lot about this on the channel. The government doesn't have political will to do that, and it seems that the only thing that will really cause the government to drastically do something is either through them coming under pressure in an election, or the fact that things get so bad that there is absolute no choice but to make drastic changes. But it's sad that we have to get to that point before any reforms might be considered.
So, Chris, I just want to add to what Herman said. Immediate things government can do: hire people regardless of their race, rather than getting expensive foreign contractors. Get the best people for the job. Buy the best supplies, regardless of who owns the company and what their race is. Decentralize the Eskom system. Privatize what can be privatized. Break up what can be broken up, and make easier the licenses for private generation. Chris, anything to add to that list before we move on?
I'd want to punt for nuclear, but that'll take way too long to build those nuclear power stations. So in terms of quick solutions, not.
Yeah, I'm a fan of the phrase I think that's going around, source agnostic, which is that at this point the need for electricity is so great that whatever, nuclear, renewables, gas, whatever, just as long as it's value for money, properly run, etc., etc.
Yeah.
Okay, let us move on to the next one. And of course, Harry already mentioned alluded to this, but we talked about it on the show yesterday, and that is the bad economic numbers that we've seen, which suggest that we're kind of in stock for recession, or a technical recession, as the cool kids in the media call it, which is 2 quarters of negative growth. We're seeing that GDP declined by 1.3% quarter on quarter at the end of 2022, which is much worse than expected. A lot of the blame, I'm sure, can be laid at the feet of Eskom. But Harry, what are your thoughts on the economic numbers we got yesterday?
I think the problem with what we're seeing is the fact that the government has become synonymous with economic destruction in this country. The economy can't move forward because the government essentially doesn't want to implement the economic reforms that will help Eskom to function properly. We're also seeing railways in the country and other types of infrastructure has, deteriorated to a significant extent. We're only using about a third of all our railway in the country at the moment. So even if Eskom is able to, you know, uh, or rather the coal that needs to be transported, we can't do that through railway at the moment. We have to do that we have to use roads, private roads, and that's not an effective way of keeping the economy going, keeping the arteries of the economy going. And that's severely damaging the mining sector, and which is a huge employer in this country. So yeah, it's these GDP figures are not surprising, and I think this is something that's going to stick around for a long time, is economic stagnation. Sorry. And yeah, our GDP per capita is going to decline, unemployment is going to increase, and yeah, it's just a terrible situation.
Chris, your thoughts on the latest economic numbers? Interestingly, often it seems that whenever we have either middling or good numbers from the economy, it seems to be driven mostly by the finance sector, which is, I think, the biggest part of our economy. And we saw contraction in that. Do you think that heralds some darker portents? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, definitely that one, but also agriculture and mining, given how important those two are. Agriculture, I think, declined by 3.3% after doing very well for the majority of last year. So even if agriculture suffers, I think, again, because of load shedding, the transport issues, the Transnet, but also softer commodity prices. So last year you had a bit more of a depressed global environment for commodities. Maybe now with China opening up again from earlier this year, we'll see a bit of a higher demand for commodities that could benefit South Africa's fiscus and South African farmers and miners and exporters. But on the other hand, can they really then deal with the non-performing entity that is Transnet? Can they find other ways to get their goods out of the country? Just a few weeks ago, you had, because of Armed Forces Day, effectively closing down Richards Bay. You had all the trucks that were transporting coal to that port having to rely on
so that we could
airfield.
show off our one working frigate that had been repaired just in time for Armed Forces Day.
And I think that frigate was transported on a truck in any case. But you had these trucks not able to move into the harbor, so they had to rely on airfields in the surrounding area, and again impacting on activity around Richards Bay. So that's another big issue. I think the sort of upside, or the hopeful side of this, is that if you've got a sense of people able to work globally, maybe being upskilled in that way, they can still work in things like the financial sector, and regardless of if things get more difficult here on the ground, they can still earn an income by working overseas. Of course, the majority of South Africans can't do that sort of work. The education system has failed them. They're not able to engage in that sort of higher level income work, as it were. They're more forced into low skilled labor. And if you don't have reliable electricity supply for mining, agriculture, you don't have those low skilled work opportunities, unfortunately. So the situation, I think, will persist for the time being. Even if next year we get radical change in government in terms of coalitions, maybe policy changes, the potential positives of that will take a while to filter through. So for the short to medium term, expect more difficulty. And from our point of view, from the CRA's point of view, we have to highlight the risk of potential unrest that could result from the sort of frustration of the status quo, where people see they don't really get any substantive job opportunities going forward. I also just think on the global point, you're possibly going to see interest rates continue to be pressed ever higher and higher. The US Fed looking like it's going to increase by 50 basis points at its next meeting, which means the South African Reserve Bank has to try and keep step. As of yesterday, you saw the rand weakening to 1866 against the dollar. So that's both a result of the Q4 2022 numbers, but also because of high interest rates. It looks like the Fed going high with their rates for the foreseeable future.
All right, let's move on to our next topic, and this is, of course, one of the great specters of malevolent government policy, which has been hanging above the country's head for many years now, and that is the National Health Insurance Plan. There was an interesting article in the Daily Maverick talking about the NHI. And this is from someone who is at least sort of ideologically sympathetic, I think, to the approach that the NHI might take, one of being in involving the state and expanding so-called universal healthcare to the population. And yet, this piece pointed out that there's just so much wistful thinking and just nonsensical aspects to the NHI bill. There's no real feasibility study that's been done. I think there was one done in Limpopo, which demonstrated that the project would be a failure. There's a lot of what NHI seems to do is essentially take money out of the private sector, ban people from buying healthcare that is already covered by NHI, and funnel a whole bunch of money into what is already a completely dysfunctional public healthcare system, where we've seen an enormous amount of corruption in recent years. At the same time, however, there are some interesting. So, on one hand, the policy is unworkable. It hasn't been properly researched. There isn't money for it, etc., etc. The DA thinks that there might be a reason for this, for the NHI's slow walk through Parliament, which is that government is beginning to have second thoughts. The DA's health spokesperson, Michelle Clark, said there was this very strange phenomenon currently going on where the NHI bill was supposed to move forward through the parliamentary process, but apparently there's just never ever time to have the meetings necessary in order to move it forward. And that she hopes that government is having a second thought about implementing the policy. So, Chris, let me start with you. Do you think that government is having second thoughts about NHI? We've seen a lot of government in recent years kind of going back to its ideological safe space on things like property rights and race-based law, which just seems to double down. But it's been interesting that despite the ANC's overwhelming desire to centralize absolutely every single system it can get its hands on, it's been so slow to implement NHI. Why do you think that is?
I mean, perhaps been slow to implement just by virtue of how complicated such a system would be, but not for lack of trying and not for lack of ideological commitment. So I want to agree with the DA on this, but I don't think you should be fooled just because they're now, quote unquote, not finding time for meetings, that they want to let go of the sort of idea of centralizing healthcare in the hands of the Department of Health, or even the Minister of Health, for example, as the NHI would require. Last year, you had the Minister of Health, Joe Pachla, indicated that they're going to try and now spend 200 billion rand on upgrading infrastructure. So, public sector hospitals, maybe training, buying of equipment. So they're going to try and do NHI, I think, in a more phased, longer term rollout sort of way. It's not going to be overnight. So take your pick, I guess, which is better. You could probably plan better and make yourself more anti-fragile if it's done in a longer term way. You can try and make plans as best as you can for your healthcare, your family's healthcare, as much as you can afford that. But I think there's very much still this commitment to, we will deliver all of your healthcare needs because that is the proper role that we should play according to the National Democratic Revolution. That is what the party should do and what the state should do for you. That is our mandate as the ANC. That's on the one hand, the ideological point, but also secondly, don't discount the benefits of being in control of 60 million citizens' healthcare and all the access to funds that gives you for all sorts of other goodies and benefits that you and the politically connected will enjoy. As the party comes under more pressure, we think in next year's elections and possibly after, there's more incentive to extend that control that they already have over the economy and society. So why not then extend it in something like the NHI, where you've got more access to funds that you can use accordingly?
Gerbrand, your thoughts on NHI?
Yeah, I think it's partly. I think it's a election gimmick. The ANC has become more radical in lots of their policy proposals as their support in elections have declined. Obviously, ideology plays a huge role. The government remains committed to centralized planning and expanding their control over people's private lives. I also think it's just too good of an opportunity for the government to pass by to gain access to even greater sources of funds through which they can, possibly supply their cadre network. But they're not planning on they're not planning on taking away the NHI, even though there are delays in the process. But I do think there's also a realization of how complex and expensive the NHI will be to implement, and yeah, I think there's this realization that it's not going to be a relatively easy thing to undertake. I also think that it speaks volumes, the fact that they did investigations a few years ago, I think in 2016, looking at looking at many public facilities, public healthcare facilities across the country. And what they determined was that it's going to be very, very difficult to implement the NHI with the current public healthcare sector, with the state of the current public healthcare sector. So there's actually no preparation. There's no idea of where the money will come from. So at the moment, it's just something that's in limbo. It's not going away, and therefore we should be cautious, and we should always be ready to fight when it finally starts, gaining speed. But I think it's stalling at the moment because it's just going to be a very, very complex and expensive endeavor that South Africa just doesn't have the resources to implement at the moment. Luckily, I think.
Yeah. No, I think that you'd see enormous damage to the country long term if NHI was implemented, which is that the middle class would, for the most part, basically try and flee the country because it would be forced into the public sector. Chris, any final thoughts before we move on?
Yeah, on your last point there, should the NHI be introduced? I think even the fact that it is hanging and the uncertainty itself disincentivizes people from maybe staying in the country, those healthcare professionals. So they might be now looking for opportunities elsewhere, because even on the best case scenario, you assume that this happens, it will be implemented in a way that benefits the politically connected. And that's not going to be good for your sort of career path, as it were, unless you want to dabble in those things, along with learning how to be a doctor and everything that requires in and of itself. If we see a decline in terms of maybe medical students who are being trained, all that sort of stuff, I think that's partly why we're seeing that sort of thing, those statistics, because something as potentially transformative in a negative sense as the NHI, even that it's just being discussed and is now hanging, is making sure that people don't want to pursue that as a career path. Similar to things like other sectors, things like farming, for example, with expropriation. Just the fact that it has been on the table and been discussed for so long, why would you undertake the risk of sinking your capital into the country if a future government can just arbitrarily seize your property?
So let's very briefly move on to our last story here. And I just want like a 30-second take from each of you guys on this. The Biden administration looks like it's going to be supporting a bill going through the US Senate, which has the support of some Republicans and some Democrats, which would give the American government the power to ban TikTok, the mobile video application in the United States. Basically, the bill gives the president the power to ban any technology that is considered a national security threat by the US Commerce Department. TikTok. So normally my inclination to this is, I don't like it when governments ban things. But there's been a lot of investigative reporting which suggests that TikTok is effectively directly controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. Its parent company, the company that produces the app ByteDance, has members of the Chinese Communist Party that are actually sit on its board and in its structures. Let me start with you, Harry. What do you make of this move? Good move, bad move? Wait and see. What are your thoughts?
I think this is just a symptom of what's going on more broadly in the world, and there's a lot of international tensions now, because of the Russian-Ukrainian war. But I also think there's lots of tension growing around Taiwan. China and the United States have a big stake in Taiwan, and so this TikTok ban. I think that it's the U.S. government. It all forms part of this broader like diplomatic conflict, international conflict that is simmering. I think it's a symptom of the U.S. and China being rivals and some of the tensions around Taiwan. So I think that's basically it's almost like a wife who fights with her husband over because he didn't wash the dishes, but it's not because she's actually angry that he didn't wash the dishes, it's because he cheated on her 2 years ago. So I think this TikTok ban is like a symptom of something much bigger going on between the US and China. Yeah.
Chris, in 20 seconds, your thoughts.
Yeah, just the risk of this national security threat. I mean, that can be defined very broadly. So you worry about some abuse of that. I agree with you. If you can link it very clearly and directly with a state actor in terms of how that could undermine your own operations, maybe then the ban for government employees to use it, for example. But then you've got the abuse thing, but also just the sort of freedom of speech concerns. I think that could be abused in the future.
Something worth keeping in mind. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for listening, and we hope that you found the show interesting. We'll see you tomorrow on the Daily Friend Show. Cheers, everyone.